All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back. We're on YouTube, and we're also. I want to first of all apologize because that's my mishap. But I do want to say to the people who are tuning in that we're ready, we're live, and you're going to learn a lot today. This gentleman, by the way, his name, I got to do all that whole introduction over, is Dr. Andrew Tobolowsky. All right. I stumbled up on his work through a Google search a couple of years ago. And just reading his book on the little sample Google had was just so amazing that I said I had to get the book, one, and two, I had to know who this guy is. So when I was putting my 20 to 20 together of 20 scholars for 20 days in Black History Month for February, I said, you know what? I got to bring this guy on. And you have so much information that I want people to understand that reading a Bible is not good enough in the 2021 and beyond. It's not enough to understand the biblical text. We have to get into what the scholars are saying and what they're doing. And this gentleman here, I'm telling you, I guarantee you, and I'm saying this to you're going to have between 150 to 200 people watching live and then probably another 15, 20 minutes. And I guarantee you, you're going to see a lot of wow in the comment section because these folks they have never heard the angle that you're coming from, which is fascinating. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me reintroduce Dr. Andrew Tobolowsky.
Glad to be here.
All right. All right. So now let me ask you this, my brother. The sons of Jacob and the sons of Heracles, why did you write this book?
Why did I write this book? Yeah, so the 12 Tribes of Israel tradition is really at the center of the Hebrew vision of who Israel is and where they came from. It's a very important tradition. It's basically how the Bible understands Israel before it is in what will later be called Israel. And the interesting thing about it is that there are pretty similar traditions in Greek mythology. So there's, Heracles is this important hero in Roman times. He's Hercules, so it's the same guy, sort of. And he has a similar kind of genealogical myth that involves his children leaving, coming back after generations, conquering these different territories. And the thing about it is that scholars of classics understand that genealogical tradition a lot differently than biblical scholars do, because they look at it in terms of when it was written and not in terms of the ancient history it supposedly reflects, and say, you can see the people who are involved in this myth kind of rewriting it to their advantage, whereas biblical scholars tend to think of the 12 tribes tradition in terms of what it reflects about early Israelite history. And just looking at it through that comparative lens is something that I think me. That's why I did it.
Okay. All right. So now let's take a look at because we're going to be covering a lot of things today. So let's cover some of the chapters in your book, the sons of Jacob and the sons of Heracles. Let's look at some of the chapters. In your introduction, you talk about genealogical myth and biblical history. And then you wrote in the following page, biblical genealogies, oral genealogies, and Greek genealogies. Why did you try to connect Bible genealogies and Greek genealogies? Why did you go about that way, and why you're saying genealogical myth?
Okay. So in the 20th century, people were really interested in this genealogy that is Jacob, his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. But they mostly studied it through the lens of two different kinds of comparisons. One comparison was with oral genealogies of African cultures and other similar traditional societies. And one of it was the linear genealogies of the ancient Near East, which is like father to son, so-and-so to so-and-so to so-and-so to so-and-so, begot so-and-so and so on. But what's actually true, if you look at the biblical text, is that those genealogies, they're not oral. Obviously, they're written down. They're not linear. They're what we call segmented, which is like a literary family tree. And that actually looks like Greek mythological genealogies. So if you come at it from the oral or linear genealogies, you're going to say, this is an ancient record of the early Israelites trying to reflect their society in this text. But if you come at it from what it actually looks like, these Greek genealogical mythologies, you're going to say this is a dynamic medium through which the people who were writing these stories tried to reorganize society in order to claim different things, advance different agendas. And
Okay. So with the so what you said something about African genealogies, right? Let's talk about that in a sense.
Sure.
Would you say African genealogies are reflected in the biblical text, or that's just something you have to research when you look in? Because I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't see why an African would write a story about a boat and talk about they born in Turkey, Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey. I think it's ludicrous. But you're a scholar, you might convince me. Go ahead, my brother.
No, I mean, I think that I think there are a lot of people who have latched onto this biblical 12 tradition and claim descent from it. There are people all over the world. The Mormons do it, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. There's groups everywhere who claim descent from the lost tribes of Israel. I think it is unlikely that there were ever really lost tribes of Israel. I don't know that, but I think it's unlikely. But the comparisons we're talking about in terms of how people studied this, they weren't saying that African genealogies were connected to biblical genealogies. They were saying that, here's a culture that has an oral genealogical tradition. They tell stories about their ancestors. They talk about genealogies. What can we learn from that to study these biblical genealogies? And because biblical genealogies are not oral, because they are written down, that comparison is not quite right. And you look at it another way, you'll come to different conclusions. But in the 1970s, especially, there were a bunch of studies of the Nuer and some other African people that suggested that a genealogical order was being used to kind of reorganize society over and over again. And so people took that as, that's what oral genealogies do. Let's look at the Bible from that perspective. It wasn't really about connection, it was about comparison.
Okay. In other words, a methodology to try to, you put right hypothesis together. All right. So let's look at another chapter here. So you have further down, you have the introduction before you even reach a chapter. You talked about the state of the evidence, Israel and Judah in early epigraphy and archaeology. Yeah. So Israel and Judah, I mean, what did you find in the early epigraphical and archaeological evidence for the Israel?
Right. So the big question here is, we know that around 900 BCE, the people the Bible calls Israel are split into two different kingdoms, Israel and Judah. So the question is, how are they related to each other, and what's the connection between them? The Bible says they were all members of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that the 12 tribes of Israel had existed for about 1,000 years before that. You're talking about, the Exodus, the Joshua led conquest, and so on and so forth. So the question is really, can we demonstrate any of that? And the answer is, well, we really can't. And in recent years, scholars have gotten a little more skeptical. I don't know what's true. I'm just, looking at the evidence. But scholars have gotten a little more skeptical, and it keeps shrinking the period in which the 12 tribes of Israel actually have existed, which raises questions about whether these two historical kingdoms were really connected to each other. When? Because the Bible claims they are. But if, for example, there's no 12 tribes of Israel long pre-history, how were they connected? So you look at that and you look at what's called the United Monarchy of David and Solomon. Before, there were two kingdoms. There was supposed to be one kingdom ruled by David and Solomon, but there's not a lot of evidence for that kingdom. There are scholars, very serious, who argue that it existed. There are some who argue that it didn't. Everybody agrees it must have been a little smaller than the Bible says. And all that kind of raises questions about, maybe this is actually the idea that all Israel lived in two different kingdoms was not a very early idea. Maybe it was kind of a later idea. Maybe the Judahites, instead of the Israelites, invented it. Maybe they developed it. And if they developed it, then they would have that would have been when they developed the 12 tribes of Israel tradition as a way of explaining their connection to the Israelites that didn't necessarily exist before.
Okay, beautiful. All right. So I'm going to skip the archaeology and the United Monarchy based on your comment. Then you talk about historical Pan-Israelitism
Right. Yeah.
and biblical Pan-Israelitism.
Right.
Can you explain both of those terms for the audience?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these are kind of my terms. They have existed before, but so in Greek mythology and in ancient Greece, there's something called Pan-Hellenism, and for a long time, scholars of classics thought that all Greeks everywhere have always thought of each other as part of the same people. But that turns out not to be true. Instead, there were all these different Greek groups that thought of themselves more separately. And eventually, in the 6th and 5th century BCE, a pan-Hellenic idea developed through the creation of a genealogical tradition that embraced different people. So originally you have like Ionians and Dorians and Ionians. Then you have a genealogy that says Ion and Doros and whoever are the children, the sons of Helen, the Pan-Hellenic ancestor. So when I say Pan-Israelitism, what I'm doing is making an analogy to that. I'm saying maybe the people of these two different places, Israel and Judah, were like these Ionians and Dorians. They didn't initially think of themselves as all Israelites. Then when they started to, they developed a tradition that embraced both Israel and Judah. That was the sons of Jacob tradition. So just like before, just like in the Greek, where you have the Ionians and the Dorians become Ion and Doros, who are the sons of Helen, maybe you have Judah, the tribe of Judah, the tribes of Israel. They become the sons of a unifying figure, Jacob. And that is when a Pan-Israelitism that's like Pan-Hellenism first appears.
Wow, that's brilliant. There was a scholar from he did a presentation for the Oriental Institute, and he brought out how the Greeks were like mercenaries for the Egyptians during the time of the Canaanites and so forth, right? So what about that time period? Have you looked into that to see any Greek influence inside of Canaan culture that could have been from before, looking at it from a different angle?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So there was the Mycenaean Greek civilization existed at the same time as a Bronze Age Canaanite culture. And they certainly had some interactions with what is today Turkey, what used to be called Anatolia. The Iliad, the Trojan War, is supposed to have happened at that time between Greeks and Turkish Anatolians. And there probably were some connections there. I'm guessing that if there were influences that produced similar genealogical traditions, they were a little bit later, but I don't know that. But they're not so late. So a lot of biblical scholars today start talking about Hellenistic influence on the region only with the conquest of Alexander the Great, which happens around 332 BCE, after most of the biblical texts are probably written. But there were, like you say, Greeks involved in the region much earlier. There were Greek missionaries. There was Greek trade. There was a big Greek trading city, Crates in Egypt in the 6th century BCE. And so I think it is pretty likely that there were influences at the time the Bible was being written from actual Greeks who were in the region doing various things.
Okay. All right. So we move on to the first chapter, the history of the tribal systems.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into the second, two pages later, you basically get into the differences. But the history of the tribal system, when do you see that coming into effect? Are you let me put it this way: are you working at a disadvantage because of tribals? Like there was writings, like the Song of Deborah is considered old, and Judges is considered old. Are you working at a disadvantage because some of these tribal systems didn't include 12? So it's like, how do you really compare if it really wasn't 12 from the beginning? And then the differences you found, I mean, in the article on the Torah.com, you made a statement that blew my mind. I'm like, this guy is a beast. You basically said when you compared the tribal listings, I don't know what the number is, but when you look at the tribal systems, a matter of fact, let me see right here. It says the counting tribal lists require a lot of judgment calls about what counts as a list, where there are two lists in the same chapter and there is only one. So there was about 30 lists, and some say I think 49 or whatever. But you find so many differences, which you're going to get to at the second part of this question. But how did you go about checking the tribal systems?
Yeah,
original?
this is the challenge. So if you're studying Greek mythology, you have a bunch of different authors who have texts that are in different places. And you don't have that with the Bible. We think that a lot of different authors were involved. We can identify, at least when some of them lived, what they were interested in, but we don't know that because all we have from ancient Israel or Judah in terms of literary text is the Bible itself. So we're guessing a lot more. But start with the question, when did the 12 tribe idea actually start? So everybody more or less agrees that of the however many lists, I think there are 26, as you say, other people got some other numbers. Everybody basically agrees that most of them are not particularly early. Everyone thinks Judges 5 is very early. Some people think Deuteronomy 33 is pretty early. Some people think Genesis 49 is pretty early, and so on and so forth. But everybody agrees that the vast majority of these lists were written in Judah after the kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, which is the event that's supposed to create the lost tribes of Israel in the first place. And what you see is that all of the late lists, they're 12 tribe lists, they're sort of familiar. But the early lists are a little weird. So the earliest list.
Hold on a second. That's important. So you're saying a lot of the lists, based off the evidence you have looked at, is basically when Judah was the main center of the religion.
That's right.
Of Israel, and it was after the Assyrian time period that you see a majority of these lists, and they don't. All right, continue from there. I just want to make sure that I'm following you. Mm-hmm.
And the weird thing is virtually everyone agrees on this. Almost everyone agrees on the chronology of when these were written. It's just that a lot of biblical scholars think that they were based on much earlier oral traditions anyway, so they don't worry about the chronology. But if you look at the chronology, you say, here's Judges 5, it's supposed to be the early list, doesn't even include the tribes of Judah, or probably Judah, Simeon, and Levi. You got Deuteronomy 33, doesn't include Simeon. Some people wonder if Judah and Levi were added to it. Genesis 49 has some weird qualities. So it almost, if you take chronology, the widely acknowledged chronology of biblical composition seriously, you can almost see that it might be the case that was an early tribal tradition that was only for the Israelites and not the Judites, that the Judites took it and added themselves into it to create the 12 tribes tradition for the first time. And I don't know for sure that that happens, but that's what it looks like, and it makes a lot of sense that the Judites used the expansionist Israelite tradition to kind of make themselves into Israelites, probably after Israel was already conquered by Assyria.
Wow. But to follow up on that, before I get into my next question in the chronological order of your book, would you say that when the Assyrians conquered, some of the priesthood may have gone down to Judah and created a whole perspective from Judah, which is like throwing a monkey wrench into researchers like yourself, because you're like, did it happen? You don't have direct proof, but it seems like someone who knew the northern history came into Judah and started writing and say, hey, we're going to write it up as 12 tribes.
Yeah, a lot of people think that there would have been Israelite refugees escaping the Assyrians who came to Judah, and that was part of the reason why these traditions that made Judah also into Israel developed. I think that's a pretty good argument.
Right.
Because it is what I was talking about, in the earlier parts of the book, when you have the archaeology, all the stuff like that, it turns out to be really hard to prove that before 722 BCE, Israelites were conquered, that the Judites thought of themselves as Israelites yet. The Bible says they did, but it's very hard to prove it outside of the Bible. And there also are some differences between what we think of as early biblical texts and later biblical texts that suggest that maybe they didn't. So yeah, I think that, the idea that some Israelites came to Judah and that's when they started creating this idea of all Israel, I think it's a good one.
Right. All right. We're going to go into details into Judges 5, Genesis 49, and Deuteronomy 33. Yeah. I want to go into them, but I want to do Genesis 49 last, because there's this guy, he calls himself Genesis 49ers, and the reason why, I don't know if you're familiar, but African Americans are a part of the whole lost tribes of Israel, and they think, some of them think that they are Judah.
Yeah.
And Genesis 49 is a reason I would want to be Judah too. I'm from Jamaica originally, and you have a sect. I don't know if you're going to have it in your studies for the lost tribes. They say they are the only people on earth that's the lost tribes of Israel, which I find absolutely nuts. But That's what they believe. But let's start with Judges 5. Why is
Yeah.
Judges 5 a problem for looking at the 12 tribes? The 12 tribes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, one problem is that it doesn't have tribes. So it is the earliest list, probably. It's missing a bunch of tribes. And the tribes that are most associated with the region of Judah, Levi, Simeon. It has some tribes that don't show up as tribes elsewhere, like Machir and Gilead are elsewhere treated as sub-tribes of Manasseh, but here they appear to be treated just as straight tribes. There's a Meroz that doesn't show up anywhere else. So this is the best bet we have for finding a very early Israelite list that hasn't been edited by Judahites in any way, because we figure if it was edited by Judahites, they would have at least added the tribe of Judah, right? And it doesn't have any of the Judahite tribes. So if you're trying to prove that the 12 tribe tradition already existed, you can't do that through Judges 5.
Wow, plain and simple. I like this guy, man. Deuteronomy 33, the last Israelite vision.
Yeah. So this is also not a 12 tribe list. It's an 11 tribe list. It doesn't have the tribe of Simeon, which is another southern tribe. And there have been scholars who suspected that Judah and Levi, the other sort of southern tribes, were added to Deuteronomy 33 long before anyone thought that the 12 tribes tradition didn't already exist. There's sort of what we call seams in the text, which suggest that possibly these were added on by Judahites later on. So I think of it as, here's Judges 5 very early in Israelite history. Here's Deuteronomy 33, probably written more towards the time when it was conquered, but in Israel. And if you take out Judah and Levi, you probably have what the 12 tribe tradition, which at that point would be maybe a 10 tribe tradition, like just before it was conquered. Because again, everybody acknowledges that the vast majority of tribal descriptions were written in Judah after that period. And so I'm sort of to trace the history through which it might have developed into 12 tribe form.
Right. I'm gonna ask you about Genesis 49, but after that, I'm gonna ask you, why do you think the Deuteronomic Judean writers, why would they want to use the number 12? But let's deal with Genesis 49 first. Why you have a problem with Genesis 49?
Right. So you said that people who use this as a way of describing themselves as part of the tribes of Israel, it's actually very common. So as I say, the Mormons, for example, have a connection to Genesis 49. They see themselves as Joseph, which is another one of those tribes in there that gets there. So the basic argument in my book is not just that the 12 tribes tradition was invented in Judah after the conquest of Israel, but that the idea that the tribes were the sons of Jacob, as opposed to just,
repeat that, sons of what?
The idea that the tribes were the sons of Jacob, patriarch Jacob, I think might have been invented in Judah. And that's what you see in the Greek mythology, that like there are these sort of groups that later myths make into sons so they can create a genealogical system that embraces all of them in this pan-Hellenism. So I'm thinking, did that happen in the Bible? And the thing about Genesis 49 is it's called the blessing of Jacob. It's supposedly a deathbed blessing where Jacob blesses all of his sons. But the only part of Genesis 49 where a person actually seems to be speaking is the first 4 tribes: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. As I said, Simeon, Levi, and Judah are the tribes that are not in Judges 5 at all. Simeon is Deuteronomy 33. And now you have, so Jacob says like, Simeon, Levi, you are X. Judah, you are lion. Reuben, you are my firstborn. There's no more yous in the rest of the poem. After that, it's like, Issachar is a strong donkey, so is a whatever. It's third person. It doesn't necessarily sound like somebody is speaking. So I'm saying, if it is the case that somebody expanded the originally smaller Israelite tradition into a 12 tribe tradition and then added this idea that these were the sons of Jacob, that's what this would look like. It would look like somebody had to add on to the idea that Jacob was talking to his sons to a tradition that already existed.
Hey, let me say it again to the audience. Now, what he basically said, if you notice in Genesis 49, they're talking in the first person, right? For the first 4, right?
Second person, yeah, Jacob, you X.
Now, if I am writing a letter to Andrew today, and I say, you are an excellent scholar, and I say, you know what? I'm going to make sure every show I do from now on, Andrew is involved. But every other scholar, you see that when I talk to them, when you look at the tape, it's from the past. It's written about in the past, right? And you see it clearly. But for those four who are connected to the southern part of Canaan, which is Judah, you see more personal, first person in we talking about it. So that would mean like someone injected themselves into the text to make them now a part of the whole Israelite paradigm, or Pan-Israelism, as you call it. And I hope I'm making it clear to the audience what you're basically saying.
That's a great summary. That's great.
All right. All right. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions for Andrew, just let me know, because I'm going to go in a direction now. We're going to be doing some rapid fire here. The history of the tribal system, part 2. Yeah. I don't really want to go into the priestly source, earliest tribalists and all that stuff. We pretty much did that. But let's talk about Jacob, Joseph, and the birth of the tribal genealogical idea.
Right.
Can you expand on that, please?
Sure. So if it's the case that it was only later on that somebody added the idea that the tribes were literally the sons of Jacob to a pre-existing tribal tradition, then you find the idea that Jacob was actually literally the father of 12 sons very often in the Bible. It'd be added on. So what I did is I said, like, all right, well, how many of these 26-ish tribe lists actually mention Jacob or imply the tribes are actual human beings? And very few of them do. So the 4 lists in Genesis do, Exodus 1 does, but then there's so many other tribal lists that never mention Jacob or imply that the tribes are human beings at all. So I developed what I call the idea of the tribal genealogical layer. It's not just about tribes, but it's also genealogical because it descended from Jacob, they're his sons. And I suggested that actually, when we don't see Jacob, we don't see the idea that these are sons, it doesn't really exist. And so then there would be a layer, sort of like a late editorial thing that appears in Genesis, that connects Genesis to Exodus, and then just by existing implies that the rest of the tribal lists can be read through this tribal genealogical framework, but actually originally they weren't.
Okay. So in your opinion, how many of the tribal lists would you find that you found that evidence in? Like, I think you said you would say it's 30. That's the number, or 31 you go by, right?
26, I think, is how many are.
All right. Yeah. So how many of those would you say were after or don't? As a matter of fact, we on Jacob now, which show Jacob is not even involved.
Yeah, most of them. So let me put it this way. All of the lists in Genesis, which is 4, Exodus 1 starts out over again. It says, these are the sons of Jacob who did X. And you're like, why do they have to remind us? Genesis 49 was 2 chapters ago. Then there are 8 lists and numbers that never mention Jacob. And there's Deuteronomy 33. He doesn't really show up there. Judges 5 doesn't mention Jacob. All right. And then there's what we call the secondary history of the books of Chronicles, which was written later than Genesis through Kings, probably. It's also a Judite history, and all the tribal lists in there, of which there are 6, are this tribal genealogical thing. So ultimately you get about, 11, 12 out of 26, but they're all really concentrated. So if you wanted to theorize that Genesis, the story of Jacob and his sons, was added to the text, and you took those out, and you wanted to say, I don't want to worry about the Chronicles history, because that is a later history, it's not written the same time as the rest of the stuff, you would have virtually no tribal lists remaining in the Bible that made it at all explicit that Jacob was the ancestor of literal tribal ancestors or necessarily connected to the tribes.
Wow. So you basically just took Jacob from every person that reads the Torah. You are going to hell, my brother.
One way to think about it. Another way to think about it is, he became the super important central figure when they were creating the Bible, right? Because ultimately it is the genealogy of Jacob that connects all these different parts, because here's the patriarchal era, and then Moses is a descendant of the Levites, and then David is the descendant of the Judites, and so on and so forth. So my argument of the tribal genealogical layer is like, actually, this was what put all the texts together and explained the connection to each other. It just happened a little later than some people think.
Yeah, the Jake art. So why do you think the Judean writers, if you didn't say it before,
Yeah.
wanted to use 12? Was this the Greek connection? Was it because I think Herodotus used to write things in 12s and break it up and all that stuff.
True.
And the Greeks had a history of writing synchronistic chronological synchronistic writing. So
Right.
they would write things in order and the history. Not that other cultures weren't having any writings, but it just wasn't like how the Greeks put it together. Can you
That's a
explain
great point. Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, yeah, I mean, the writing is not a thing that a lot of ancient people did. They had traditions about the past, but writing narrative history, so like this happened and then this happened, you're really just talking about the Greeks and the Israelites, which I think is another really interesting thing. But yeah, I mean, exactly. So the question of, I think you're right that 12 is just a number that peaked in this region. The question of why Judahites present themselves as Israelites is complicated. People have suggested various different things. But when Israel is conquered in 722 BC, it's likely that a bunch of Israelite refugees go to Judah. It's likely that the Jews try to take over some Israelite territory. It's likely that Israel, which is a lot bigger and more powerful when it exists, has greater prestige in the region. So creating a framework by ending this smaller tribal list into a 12 tribe list is a way of claiming more territory. It's a way of incorporating refugee Israelites into the Judahite polity. It's a way of claiming a more history than maybe they up to that point. And I think all of that goes into the creation of this vision of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob.
Okay. I gotta stay on chapter 3 for one more second. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the history of the tribal system. This is Andrew Tobolowsky's book he released in 2017. It's a great read if you're into this stuff. I'm into this. Not a lot of people are this deep into this stuff.
That's great.
But the tribal birth narratives, this is another clue that you gave to show that these are different writers. You know, a lot of people talk about the JEPD theory, the documentary hypothesis. I think it has some legitimacy with it, but now I hear people talking about the supplemental hypothesis,
right,
you know, to add on to the documentary, which is cool. But talk about the tribal narratives and why you have an issue with that.
Okay, good. So Genesis 29 through 30 is the story of the birth of the 12 ancestors to Jacob and 4 different women. His 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, and their enslaved women, Bilhah and Zilpah. And, you know, the way to think about it is like it's 12 women who are supposed to have been born over the course of 7 years, despite 12 sons who are supposed to have been born over the course of 7 years, despite nobody having, being pregnant at the same time. So that's not possible, right? That can't happen.
So you say that 12 children are born in a 7-year period, and nobody's pregnant at the same time.
That's the impression the text gives you.
Oh man. I hope you repent. I hope you repent after this interview, brother.
And then later on, when you see any of the tribal ancestors doing things, so that by the end of the Genesis, they die, right? So they die in Exodus 1, tribal ancestors die. So they don't have that much time to do stuff, just Genesis 30 to Exodus 1. And the tribes that do stuff, so Joseph and Benjamin are very important. But besides them, it's only Judah, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, the same group that we've been talking about all along, the same group that are the top of Genesis 49 and so forth. So the fact that this is mathematically impossible, combined with the fact that mostly the tribes who still exist after 722 BC get ancestor stories, suggests to me that, you know, this story was expanded, and then also more traditions were written about the ancestors who still mattered only after this idea that they were ancestors first developed.
Another thing with the birth narratives is that the Bible is giving honor to Yahweh for some and giving Elohim to some. So now again goes back to those southern tribes again giving honor to Yahweh
Right.
and the other tribes giving honor to Elohim. I think there was one person that gave to both, but you could see the redaction and people adding on. You know, for the audience that's watching, you got to think to yourself, if God is the person that's inspiring you to write the book, and let's just say for argument's sake, Moses wrote it, and he's rewriting off the inspiration of the Most High. And why is he saying, you know what? Yahweh is the one that they give praise to based off the history for having a child. I thank you, Yahweh. And then further down in the same paragraph, you're saying, oh, they're giving praise to Elohim. It shows that there's two different people or two different priesthood that's injecting something into the text. Can we go back and look at it and have a primary source for it? No. You use a methodology by applying you apply a methodology to your research and you come to conclusions. And the conclusion to me is clear, you know, based off of Andrew's work and other works, that there are other people injecting into the text for their own personal reasons. All right. Let me see what else I want to touch on, because I wanted to leave. All right. So you know what? I'm not even gonna I'm gonna leave your book for now. But I do want to say to everybody, you need to get the book called The Sons of Jacob and the Sons of Heracles. All right. Do you want to talk about the Athenian League or the Amphictyonian League, or how the Greeks also did those type of things, and the Bible also does it? I don't know if you want to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, all I'll say about that is, like I say, throughout the 20th century, biblical scholars approached these 12 tribe traditions through the lens of some comparisons don't actually look like the 12 tribes tradition. What does look like the 12 tribes tradition is these Pan-Hellenic Greek genealogical myths, descent from Heracles, descent from Helen, and so on and so forth. But over there, what you see is that these traditions get built over time as Athenians and Spartans and things like that start jockeying for position by inventing new stories about, you know, their ancestors. So even if all we say is, you know, the 12 tribes tradition, it can have appeared at any time, you know, but we shouldn't think of it, if we look at it through the lens of a more comparison, as preserving early realities so much as being a medium through which the descendants of these early tribes jockeyed for position. So you said the other day, you know, you want to be Judah in Genesis 49, right? That's a great tribe to be. Mm-hmm. But if you're asking the question, why does a Judahite author make Judah sound great in a text? Is it more likely that it's because Judah was really important a long time ago, or because that guy's trying to make Judah look good? And so this, there's lots of evidence in the Bible that, you know, these tribal traditions were written by people who wanted to make Judah look good, Judahites, right? So that's what I'm talking about.
All right. Again, let me tell you the name of the book. It's called The Sons of Jacob and the Sons of Heracles. Let me ask you this. Let's move on to the whole lost tribes thing, because sure. You're doing some research on that. It's fresh in your mind. You got all the daggers for me. So why, you know what, on a funny note, based on what you just said about Judah and Genesis 49, why no one in these lost tribe stuff claims Zebulon? I never hear a bunch of people saying, I'm Zebulon.
You never see Zebulon, yeah.
Why they don't claim Zebulon? It sounds good. It's not, the name is cute.
It's a good name, yeah. No, I mean, a number, like, you don't meet a lot of Issachars either. It's like, and I think a lot of it goes back to Genesis 49 and texts like that. They don't make them look good enough for people to want to be them. You get a lot of Ephraim, you get a lot of Manasseh. Those are the sons of Joseph. And so Joseph is a big deal in the Bible. You get a lot of Judah. You get a lot of Levi, because they're the priestly tribe. And in weird cases, you'll get Dan or something else. But yeah, there's a lot of them they just don't bother with.
You mentioned earlier, Joseph and Benjamin was important. And I forgot to piggyback on that, that point. Why was, I know why, but tell the audience, why was Joseph and Benjamin important at that point for the writers?
Yeah, so two things are probably true. So after Israel is conquered, the biblical text claims that all of the Israelites were taken into exile, into Assyria, which is where the lost tribe story starts. In reality, there were a lot of people taken away, but there were still a lot of people who remained behind. All right, so the Bible claims that all of the Israelites were replaced by foreign peoples, but that's another one of those Judite propaganda things. We actually don't have any archaeological evidence that a lot of foreigners were brought in. They probably weren't. So even after Israel's conquered, there's still some Israelites in what used to be Israel. They're just part of the Assyrian Empire. And they are probably Ephraimites and Manassites of the tribes of Joseph, because that is the region of Israel that is closest to Judah. Israel gets smaller. That's probably why Joseph is such a big deal in the Bible. Benjamin probably started out as a northern tribe, but it was the most southerly Israelite tribe. And it seems pretty clear that sometime between 700 and 550 BCE, Benjamin becomes a tribe of Judah. It sort of switched allegiances. It was always kind of a border territory. So early traditions where you talk about Benjamin as kind of an Israelite tribe, later traditions have Benjamin as a Judite tribe, seems to have switched. And so, yeah, I think that's written into the biblical text, that they've still got to talk about Joseph and Benjamin because they still exist, and Benjamin has now become part of Judah. And you see a lot of jockeying there.
Right. Isn't it weird that Simeon, where Simeon is located, it's considered a northern tribe? Isn't that kind of weird to another? It's considered a northern tribe, and it's south of Judah, which is a southern tribe. That
That's
just
right.
puzzled me about the Bible.
And Simeon, I mean, it basically disappears. You really don't hear much about Simeon in the books of Kings, for example. But you do, I mean, so some biblical texts say that Simeon's territory was in Judah. Some say it was more southerly than Judah. I got no idea what's going on out there. You know, it's a really interesting topic.
I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but in my community, the guys who are professing to be Hebrew or Israelites or modern day Jews, right? They don't like to use the term Jew, by the way. And I hope I don't offend you by asking you this. They consider Esau in the Bible to be the white man.
Right.
And they consider Jacob, of course, they descend from Jacob.
Right.
Can you tell us about, I've read Philip Wachenbaum's work, I've read Russell Gmerkin's work, I've looked at the Greek stories, I've seen it myself. So I don't want the audience to hear from me. But can you talk about Jacob and Esau in the womb and connect it as far as the ancient Near East, Southern Europe story, how it got in the Bible and what was its purpose?
Good. So the Bible, Genesis is actually pretty clear on this. Esau is the ancestor of the kingdom of Edom. And Edom is right next to Judah. And they seem to have fought some war each other. They seem to have worked together sometimes. The book describes some alliances between them. It describes some wars between them. And so it makes sense that you have a genealogical story that Jacob and Esau are related to each other because they are neighbors and they had a lot in common over the course of their ancient history. That being said, taking biblical names and biblical tribes and things like that and applying them to later realities is extremely common, not just in the African American community, in the Jewish community. In rabbinic literature, sometimes Edom is Christianity because it's like this biblical antagonist. In other places, it has other meanings. But people, they love to take the relationships that the Bible describes and apply them to new reality. There's in the medieval period, there were a lot of medieval chroniclers who thought that the Mongols were the lost tribes of Israel because they knew the biblical story that the lost tribes of Israel were supposed to be taken somewhere into the east. And then all of a sudden, in the 13th century, these massive armies start coming in from the east and conquering a lot of Asia and encroaching on Europe. And so they say, obviously, it's the lost tribes coming back. So this is just a very common human thing that people do. And I know that it's common in some parts of the African American community today.
I heard that even the Afghanistan people have a tradition of the lost tribe, and somebody was trying to connect bin Laden to to be one of the lost tribe. I'm like, what? You can't even make this stuff up. It's just, oh man, it's like reality TV. You can't make it up.
There's so many.
With the lost tribes, I'm trying to figure out. I mean, I had Tudor Parfit on. He's one of the famous guys that deal with it. He calls it a myth.
Yep.
And you know, he said it's something metaphorical people use as far as inspiration, African Americans and so forth. They still, and using the Moses, and they call Harriet Tubman the Black Moses and
Right.
so forth. And it's like, I understand that. I understand the reality of using the text, but to now literally say that's you,
Yeah.
and then you breaking down that Jacob being added, you're giving a reality check to anyone who subscribes to the Bible as
Right.
ultimately the word of God. And by the way, me or Andrew is not bashing. I don't even know what Andrew believes. We're not bashing anybody's belief. Your belief is your comfort zone. That's you. What we're saying is that there is another reality to the research, archaeology, history, linguistics, genetics, and all that stuff brings together that shows us a whole nother angle to this. And you have sociologists now coming out trying to tell us why people claim lost tribes. But what do you say to all of that?
Yeah, so just like you said, I teach classes. I have a lot of believers in there. I never want to offend them. I hope they find it interesting. I don't want to attack anyone's belief in any way. All I'm trying to do is say, like, here's what the evidence is. Make of it what you will. But it's really this interesting phenomenon. So my suspicion is that you have this 12 tribe concept of Israel, and then because of the biblical account of the lost tribes of Israel, you got sort of like 10 slots open up in being Israel. And because the Bible isn't specific about where they can go anywhere. So there are stories about how some of them went to, and they can break up into different parts because there's 10 of them, right? So just like you're saying, figurative identifications with Israel are super common, like the Black Moses, for example. But we're talking about a long, long history of literal identifications with Israel that use the fact that the disappearance of the vast majority of Israel, 10 tribes of Israel, means that somebody has to be Israel somewhere out there. So one really interesting story is the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, because so in Ethiopia, there were traditions of being Israelites among both the Beta Israel, who are Jewish Israelites, Jewish Ethiopians, and among Christian Ethiopians.
Right.
The Kebra Nagast, yeah. So the Kebra Nagast, an Ethiopic text, tells a story of how there was a son of Solomon named Menelik, who Solomon and the Queen of Sheba came to Ethiopia, and Tuta writes about this a lot. And so the Ethiopians are Israelites. But then in the 16th century, in the 19th century, Jewish missionaries start showing up. They think the Ethiopians are the Beta Israel, the tribe of Dan. Eventually, the modern state of Israel decides that they are the tribe of Dan, and they're brought to Israel, they come to Israel, they're allowed to become citizens. And that's the power of this myth, that the idea that Israel is out there somewhere. You even have Jewish and Christian and so on experts who are open-minded to the possibility that somebody more out there is a descendant of Israel. But it's extremely, extremely common. There's Appalachian Israelites. There's, I was reading the other day about the House of David baseball team in the mid 19th century.
Right.
This was kind of a weird cult that existed in Michigan. And the baseball team was the fundraising arm of these people. And they did a lot of stunts. They also played against some of the early Negro Leagues teams. But they were one of the only white outfits that would do that. And it's because...
How far are you with the Native Americans as far as the lost tribes? How far are you? Because I know James Adair, and I think we spoke about this on the phone. He's like the main guy that these Black Hebrew Israelites use. And what happened is he had come out with some research saying there's the Hebrew words and the Native American words. They might be similar. They might have a root. So these people are Jewish and they're Jews, the lost tribes of Israel. What do you say about James Adair, if you're familiar? I don't know if you're familiar.
A little familiar, but there actually are just lots and lots of people like James Adair. So the idea that the Native Americans were Israelites seem to have been almost as old as Columbus. Almost as soon as Europeans are coming here, they're talking about maybe these are Israelites. And there's a reason for that. If you read Genesis 10, everybody is descended from the sons of Noah, right? Because there's a flood, and then Noah repopulates the earth. So every time you meet a new people, you got to be like, who are they? Where do they fit? And so everybody's looking for the lost tribes of Israel because they're supposed to be lost tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
These studies go with what I think are superficial similarities that aren't really there between Native American traditions and Hebrew. They were very common in the 18th century. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson wrote each other letters being like, maybe the Native Americans are Israelites. When Lewis and Clark go west, Dr. Benjamin Rush, an important revolutionary figure, tells them, try to figure out if the Native Americans are Israelites. And ultimately, the Book of Mormon describes the arrival in America of some people out of the tribe of Manasseh who ultimately become the Native Americans as well. So it's called the Jewish Indian theory, very old, very common. I don't think there's that much to it historically, but there are many people in the world today who would disagree.
Oh boy, I mean, it's sad, but listen, man, where do you teach at right now, by the way? If anybody wants to go crash into your class,
That's my class, yeah. I'm at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Where you at? Okay, William and Mary. Okay, yeah. Okay. What is it like teaching there? Is it fun?
It's great. I got great students. They're smart. I like that it's a public school, so it gets a lot of people from the community.
What state is it in? What state is William Mary in?
Williamsburg, Virginia.
Okay, Virginia. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Hampton Roads area. We're about an hour from Richmond.
Okay. All right. Let me see if there's any questions for anyone in the chat for you. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Tobolowsky at this point? We got 130 people watching right now. Let me see. Any questions? All right. Let's so we have, let me just wait for the questions to come in. But based on what you're saying, as far as Jacob and all that stuff, how did you feel? Because you grew up in a Reformed Judaism home. How did that, how did it change you as an individual? And what was it like telling your parents about this change?
Yeah, I mean, we're none of us are so observant and religious that this kind of idea is challenging to us too much. But I think it's, I'm going to agree with Dr. Parfit here. I mean, these stories, whether they're true or not, are stories that people have found incredible meaning in, and not just literal meaning, but symbolic meaning, and it means something to them. And for me, none of this means that it has to stop. So you can almost think of, if it is true that the Judahites sort of invented this 12 tribes of Israel idea, even from an earlier tradition, you can almost see them as the first kind of lost tribe group. Because they're already taking this tribal tradition and expanding it so it includes them. They want to be part of Israel. And so when I see other people doing that today or 500 years ago, whatever, I think this is a this is a biblical thing people are doing. They're using this tradition to connect themselves to it.
Okay. But Andrew, none of them are trying to go back to Israel. That's the problem. They're not trying to go back to Israel. They all want to stay in America or Cuba or whatever. Say, yes, I'm Israel, but they're not trying to go back. So
the Beta Israel of Ethiopia did. And they're not the only ones who tried. I was reading the other day, I don't know if it was the Igbo Jews of Nigeria or somewhere else, but there is a bunch of African Jews who right now there's a court case in Israel that's deciding whether or not they should be included in what's called the right of return.
Right.
So Jewish people get Israeli citizenship. They claim to have a Jewish heritage, and then they studied in the conservative Jewish religious tradition. They want to go to Israel. But yeah, lots of people don't. They just want to stay out here. But there is an idea of a new Israel, a new Jerusalem that's very common. And that's why a lot of people don't want to go back to Israel. They want to create a new Israel somewhere else.
What do you think about, can you tell us a little about British Israelism?
Oh, yeah. So that's in the middle of the 19th century that shows up. And like I say, not very different from Mormonism, same kind of time period. You're talking about the Book of Mormon comes out in 1830, 1848, I think is the first British Israelite book. To me, it's a descendant of a kind of European anti-Semitism to begin with.
Right.
other people might disagree with that, but the basic idea is you got all these Christians who know that the Israelites are supposed to be God's chosen people, but you also got a lot of Europeans who they're anti-Semitic. They don't like the Jews. So what are they going to do? And they sort of invent the idea, well, maybe we're the real Israelites.
Right.
And because of the lost tribes of Israel idea, they're able to do that. Since nobody knows where the lost tribes went, they can be found anywhere. And so the British Israelites come out of this 150-year-old at that point Protestant tradition of wondering if maybe we're the real Israel after all. And they take it to a more explicit place, but not that different a place from a lot of others.
Let me see. Ask him which deity did the Judean priests worship, and when did they adopt that deity, and from whom?
Yeah. So when people debate about whether Israel and Judah were originally connected or not, one thing that most people agree is that they have basically the same religion. They are both followers of Yahweh. One of the things you get out of the Bible is a question of like, are these people really monotheists, or are they more polytheistic? Because the Bible is always criticizing people for worshiping other gods. And at a certain point, you got to say, it seems like they worshiped other gods kind of a lot, you know? So yeah, I think they believed in Yahweh. One way we know is people's names. A lot of ancient names have the names of gods in them. So Jonathan, for example, comes from Yahweh. Natan, Yahweh gives. Joshua has that Yahweh in there. You get a lot of names in Judah and in Israel that have nods to Yahweh the God. But you also have other gods, Baal, Asherah, things like that.
Do you subscribe to Yahweh coming from like the Edomite tribes?
I think that's a reasonable position. Yeah, we don't really know, but yeah, there's the idea that he comes from the southern region. There's some early poems in the Bible that suggest as much. The region of Edom, the region of Zaire. Yeah, I think it's reasonable.
The irony in that is that in the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, Edom and Esau is the white man.
That's
so
right.
Why are they worshiping the white man's God, which is Yahweh?
Right. It's an interesting.
The irony in that.
Right.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Let's see what we got. How important is the Levantine printing press to the proliferation of these religious dogmas? I don't know if I understand that question. Do you understand that question?
I'm guessing that there is a story about the existence of an early printing press in the region. I don't think there was. I think,
okay, right.
I think printing press was invented by Johann Gutenberg or one of those people at that time, and not earlier.
Let me ask you this: what role, to interrupt what you just said, what role would you think the printing press played in the lost tribe stuff, though? Because remember, the whole Eldad Danite and Prester John, the printing at 1400 and the printing press, and then you had the Christians had their own version of Prester John's story. They had a Jewish version, they had this version. So it's like there's a battle to put information out, and then the printing press is here. So now we could put whatever we want out.
That's right.
In mass.
I think not. I think, first of all,
worldwide.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it lets normal people have a Bible, so they can do some of that reading themselves, right? Because now it can be produced cheaply. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Prester John stuff is a great example. Legends proliferate across all of Europe and get changed in various ways. You can't have that proliferation without the mass production of texts. And obviously, traditions made their way around before, but not quite as much.
Andrew, for moving forward after Black History Month, I'm thinking about doing a Friday methodology show where scholars would come on and show how they would put up some slides. And would you be interested in something like that? So we could talk about Genesis 49, Deuteronomy 33, and Judges 5, how you came to a conclusion that there was some other author or somebody redacting. I would really love for you to do it. If I don't, you're a teacher, so you got to mark all these papers.
I think we could probably work that out.
Yeah, man, in the future, because I think you're a great mind. My community needs this great mind right here. I'm telling you.
I appreciate it.
I'm serious. I think, and just to throw a name out here, like a brother, like a Daniela, he's somebody I would bring on as a Hebrew Israelite. And he's very moderate in his thinking at times. I mean, he holds to the I'm a, Israelite and all that stuff, and tribe of Benjamin. But I think he's somebody I would love for you to like have a conversation with. He wouldn't be disrespectful. You wouldn't be disrespectful.
Sure.
And you guys could talk about the methodology and how you reach to a conclusion. I think that would be beautiful. I mean, a lot of people might would support that. I mean, I'll reach out to the brother eventually, but at the end of the day, I'm gonna have a methodology show. I mean, Joshua Bowen, he's in, I think in Virginia too, Dr. Joshua Bowen, and he's actually, I'm gonna bring him on to talk about Daniel and Daniel 9 and all that stuff. But I think the community needs, brothers and sisters, get that book, The Sons of Jacob and the Sons of Heracles. I'm telling you, family, your mind will be changed forever. When I read it, it was a wrap. I'm done. I was, that's it. I don't think I need to read any other book, really get into no more books anymore. I've read most of Tudor Parfit's work. I've read a lot of Russell Gmerkin's work. I've read Richard Hess's work. I got Daniel Fleming coming on tomorrow. He's the guy that deal with time at Emar and going to these different ritual stuff that we do in Judaism. So we have a well-rounded 20 scholars coming on that's really dealing with this from different angles. And to hear your angle is actually very refreshing. Let me see if we have
Daniel and I know each other pretty well, and he's, we do a lot of similar stuff. I think he's a great scholar.
Right, definitely. Tomorrow, he's one of my heroes. He doesn't even know, but he'll find out tomorrow. He just actually emailed me and say he's gonna be ready by 11:30. So he's on tomorrow at 12 o'clock for those who are watching. Daniel Fleming. Then I have Tim O'Neill coming on at 5 p.m. He's coming on live from Australia. The whole time different stuff is crazy, but
Busy.
It's gonna be fun. Yeah.
Busy man.
All right. I don't see any more questions. I'm having fun. I mean, I could keep it going, but I do want to say thank you for taking the time out to have this discussion. We need more of this in the community. And I mean, I'll reach out to you. We could probably call each other on the phone and we could discuss future endeavors and so forth. But I do need to speak to you. I don't know what you're doing after this. I do need to speak to you and ask you something about one of your books off the air. All right. But ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Andrew Tobolowsky. I told you at the end of this show, your whole mindset is going to change. Scholars 20 for 20, number 9, Dr. Andrew Tobolowsky, The Origins of the 12 Tribe System, Greek Genealogy and the Bible. And by the way, the number 9, when I was part of the Nation of Islam, they used to teach the number 9 represents completion. A woman is pregnant for 9 months. So I used to follow those pseudo teachings at times. But anyway, I'm out of here, family. And I hope you guys enjoy the show. Peace.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
This is your brother Garfield. All right, hold on a second, Andrew.